Welcome everyone to my new house. I actually just started moving in this week. The furniture and stuff's not here yet, but my computer equipment has moved because the internet has already been transferred to this house. Now, I'm in my new studio space at the house, which has not yet been soundproofed and adjusted for light and dealing with like the echoes and things like that. So for the first couple of weeks, bear with me as I get the sound and the lighting and all that stuff tweaked. I also haven't brought over all of my toiletries yet, which means I took a shower here but forgot I didn't have my hair gel, so I had to throw the hat on. I don't typically, in more recent times, record wearing my hat, but that's the case today. So with all of that in mind, I noticed that since a new PHILOMENA CUNK series came out in the last couple of weeks, that all of my old reaction videos to PHILOMENA CUNK stuff is trending and doing really, really well right now on YouTube. So as I've been doing here and there, I will throw together a compilation of all of the previous work that I've done reacting to PHILOMENA CUNK. And just a heads up, the very first one I did, I'm actually going to throw at the end because I feel like it's my least favorite one. The first time I reacted to her, I kind of like found myself repeating her jokes a lot, and I would imagine it was not real easy to watch. So I'm going to put the later ones first because I think they're a little more entertaining, a little more interesting. Yes, I get that it's comedy. I get that the people she's interviewing know that there's something going on, though they don't necessarily know what she's going to ask. I understand that I'm being a killjoy by breaking down the comedy and explaining it all, but if you didn't want that, you can just go watch PHILOMENA CUNK. I'm here as a historian to give the background while we simultaneously are entertained and laugh and cringe and shake our heads and all of the things that one might do when it comes to her videos. So without further ado, here you go. It's a compilation series of all of my reactions to PHILOMENA CUNK. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone, as we dive back into some more of our favorite non-historian PHILOMENA CUNK. If you are not familiar with her, it's actually a role portrayed by an actress named Diane Morgan, who pretends to be a complete moron when it comes to interviewing historians about historic events, and the results are pretty funny if you like this style of humor, which I really do. So what we're going to do, as I do with all of these videos, is we're going to watch, we're going to laugh along, we're going to be entertained, but then I'm also going to try to offer some real historical commentary, give some background, give some information so we can laugh, but also actually learn a little bit in the process. So join me on the journey. Today we're going to dive into some excerpts from episode 2 of Kunk on Britain, The Empire Strikes Back. So specifically, we're going to be looking at what she has to say about the Tudors. So Henry VIII and his children who sat on the throne. Let's go ahead and see what it's all about.
And finishing them in another.
And looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them.
Henry didn't get arrested after he killed his first wife, did he? What sort of mistakes did the Tudor police make that led him to kill again?
So, right off the bat, he didn't kill his first wife. I mean, I guess she probably means the first wife that he killed. People often say divorced, beheaded, and died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So he divorces Catherine of Aragon. He has Anne Boleyn executed on trumped-up charges of adultery. It was actually just a way for, I think, probably motivated primarily by Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry's kind of right-hand man at the time, getting rid of all of the enemies. So they accused these other guys that they probably had reasons to get rid of sleeping with Anne, had them all executed. Jane Seymour dies from complications of childbirth, giving him his son. He divorces Anne of Cleves. Catherine Howard really did cheat on Henry and was executed probably as a teenager still. And then Catherine Parr outlived him.
All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, PHILOMENA CUNK, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Kunk on Britain.
United Britain of Great Kingdom.
Last week, we discovered how God invented Britain. who the Romans were,
Bath.
and why we went to war with the Roses. But that was just the beginning. By the time the Wars of the Roses ended, Britain was literally on the map, somewhere near the top, showing how important it was. The British had a firm grasp of the solid parts of the country, like this rock. But there was a load of stuff around the edges that wouldn't do as it was told. It was wet, it was full of fish, and it wouldn't make up its mind how close to the rock it wanted to be. In this episode, I'll discover how Britain came to rule the waves and invent the umpire. It's a story about events beyond Britain's coastline, so I'll be using the C word a lot. Sea. This is Hampton Court Palace, a building so impressive it has to be accompanied by harpsichord music.
It has to be. Oh, man. So Hampton Court Palace was actually built by Cardinal Wolsey, who was, for a time, Henry VIII's chancellor, and had a falling out with Henry because he couldn't secure Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn. And at some point along the way in all of this, Hampton Court Palace is transferred to Henry.
These days, Hampton Court is open 10 till 4:30 in the winter, 10 till 6 in the summer, with last entry to the maze 45 minutes before closing. Prices start at £18.40 per adult and £9.20 per child. A family ticket will set you back at least £32.30, unless you're buying that ticket in the 15th century and your family name is Tudor.
Nice.
But what do we mean by the word Tudor? Let's ask an expert.
What do we mean by the word Tudor?
The word Tudor is quite controversial because the Tudors at the time didn't call themselves Tudor. Tudor is the family name, the Welsh family name of the ancestors on the father's side of King Henry VII. But the only person who calls Henry VII Henry Tudor is Richard III when he's trying to stop him becoming king. And he uses the name Tudor just to mean this is some random Welsh person rather than an appropriate person to replace me as.
Right, because Henry Tudor's claim to the throne really comes through his mother. On his father's side, he is actually descended from Catherine of Valois, who was French nobility, and becomes Queen of England to Henry V. And then after Henry V dies, she has a couple of children with this kind of nobody from Wales named Owen Tudor, or Owen ap Tudor, as it would have been in Welsh. And to talk about his family name would have been to remind everyone that he was not descended through a male line of any kind of nobility.
King. So the Tudors don't use the name Tudor very much at all. Some people refer to it as being their family name later on.
Sorry, I had that thing, where your brain stops listening.
If the Tudors were the Kardashians of their time, this was their Kim. Henry VIII, the kingiest king who ever kinged over Britain.
If you had to draw a king, you'd definitely draw him, although maybe not as well as this, unless you're a 16th century portrait artist.
Yeah, most of the portraits we have from that time, the really good ones, are from a guy named Hans Holbein, who very famously makes the portrait that convinces Henry to marry Anne of Cleves. But then he sees her in person and says she looks like a horse. They call her a Flanders mare. He says she looks nothing like she did in the portrait. He basically feels like he got catfished. And it's important to note that Henry did not look like that for most of his life. We always think of Henry VIII as fat. That was really only the end of his life. He was very handsome, very athletic, was a regular jouster, and it's probably jousting that led to him getting fat. He got this really bad injury in the 1530s in his leg, and it festered and had pus and smelled and was awful for the rest of his life. And he kind of stopped being so athletic and active and started eating a lot and just ballooned up in the last decade or so of his life.
But what was so great about Henry VIII? Why is he the king we all still remember?
It's interesting to see that drawing, the way they prominently show his calves, because a lot of people who visited Henry VIII's court would talk specifically about what great calves he had.
Unlike, say, Richard V. Well, for one thing,
There is no
he
Richard
was
V.
fat, so he takes up more room in the memory. But Henry's also memorable for his chronic wife addiction. He had 6 wives, all called Catherine.
He was a Catherineaholic, or
He was a Catherineaholic. There were 3 Catherines, not 6.
Catholic for short.
He got through so many Catherines, he actually got bored of killing them and had to invent a new way of getting rid of them, called
He only killed 1 Catherine.
divorce.
The Pope hated divorce, so Henry decided to divorce him. He took back control, broke with Europe, and made up a new religion, which it turns out is easier to do than popes like to pretend.
Henry created the Church of England, didn't he? Did he have to find a British pope?
He didn't need to find a British pope. You could just have bishops. You can just use the bishops and people that you've got in there already.
If you had to find...
Yeah, but Henry made himself the head of the Church of England. Now, as I've mentioned other times we've talked about Henry VIII, to the end of his life, considered himself to be Catholic. He just didn't want to be under the authority of the Pope because he felt like as a divinely anointed king that there shouldn't be anyone who had any sort of authority over him in his own country, and that included the church. So he felt that the king should also be head of the church. So he made himself that. And people like John Fisher, who was a cardinal, Catholic cardinal, Sir Thomas More, are executed for refusing to recognize Henry as head of the church. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury becomes the supreme kind of religious figure in the Church of England, but the king is still over him. And even today, King Charles III is the supreme governor of the Church of England.
And a British pope now, who would you go for?
You couldn't use the Archbishop of Canterbury.
No, you have to have someone else.
Someone from without the church.
Yeah, like Matt Baker of The One Show.
So you're Matt Baker off The One Show.
He's not an obvious choice, you see, that's why I think he'd be good. But the more you think about it, the more it makes sense.
Henry VIII kept having a go on new wives because he wanted a boy to pop out of one of them, and eventually one did, called Edward. When Henry died, Edward became king, aged just 9 years old.
Yeah, so Edward is the son of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. She dies afterwards of what they called childbed fever, some kind of an infection. Same thing that Henry's mother died of in her late 30s, Elizabeth of York. And even though there's a lot of fictional parts to the TV show The Tudors, there's this very poignant scene when Henry VIII, played by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, who's just fantastic, is standing in the doorway of his wife's bedroom, and he's looking at her, and he says to someone, "It's childbed fever. I know because my mother died of it." And that was a hard time in Henry's life. So the Lord Protector then, under the young Edward VI, is going to be Edward's uncle, who is Jane Seymour's brother. And 2 of Jane Seymour's brothers are prominent in the government. One of them, Thomas Seymour, actually marries Henry's widow, Catherine Parr, and she dies from childbirth. And both Thomas and Edward Seymour are both going to be executed for treason against the government, even though they are the uncles of the king.
Edward died aged 15, the youngest anyone had ever died of old age.
The youngest anyone. So he probably had tuberculosis, and there are a lot of people that think that because Henry was so obsessed with having a son, and when he finally had a son who survived childhood, that he kind of tucked him away and kept him protected, and they would like scrub the home that he was living in several times a day, and they think that they never really gave his immune system a chance to build up any kind of protection against things because they kept him so protected.
He was followed as king by Lady Jane Grey. She ruled for 9 glorious days, almost a week. These were among the fastest royals we've ever had.
So Jane Grey is the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. And the reason that at the last minute, right before he dies, Edward VI changes his will to try and get the succession to pass to her instead of to his older sister Mary, who had been barred from the throne previously, but everything kind of goes back and forth. Mary and Elizabeth were both declared bastards because Henry basically disowned his marriages to their mothers. But everything kept getting changed. But Jane Grey, she makes one big mistake, or the people who put her on the throne, because she's kind of a pawn in all this. She's Protestant, which is why they want to go to her rather than Mary. But what happens is they don't secure Mary first. They put her on the throne and they announce her as queen before making sure that they had Mary in possession. And so Mary's out there while Jane's being proclaimed as queen, gathering loyal followers, and she comes in and basically dethrones her. And everything's okay for a while for Jane, but then people try to do an uprising against Mary on behalf of Jane, and this time she has her executed.
After Jane came this woman, Queen Mary. And there really was something about Mary, but not something funny like Cameron Diaz with all dried spunk in her hair. Mary's something was religious intolerance.
Mary's something was religious intolerance. And it's not unique to Mary. Religious intolerance was kind of the name of the game on both sides. The Protestants persecuted Catholics. The Catholics persecuted Protestants. A lot of Protestants were persecuted by Henry VIII, were burned at the stake, things like that. Because again, he thought himself as a loyal Catholic. And so then Mary is known as Bloody Mary for the stuff that goes on during her reign. Thomas Cranmer, for example, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, is burned at the stake during all of this.
She had so many Protestants burnt at the stake. She became known as Bloody Mary because, like the drink, she was horrible. The next queen was Queen Elizabeth, who in the first of many such coincidences appeared just in time for the Elizabethan era.
Westminster Abbey, amazing place.
Queen Elizabeth I got a crown screwed on here in Westminster Abbey.
Westminster Abbey. So you actually go in, if you ever visit, over to the left from as we're looking at the screen, and then you go down, the entrance is on the other side. This is where you come out, but right inside these doors is where you have, for example, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. And during non-coronation times, as soon as you would go in those doors, right to the right behind, I think it's plexiglass or something, is where the coronation chair is on display, that you can see it normally. And then you start immediately having all these graves of like a lot of prime ministers are right there. And then up to the left, not too far in, is where you're going to see like Stephen Hawking and Isaac Newton. And it's just an amazing place. You can't go in that way. She trips.
Elizabeth I was a new sort of king, in that she was a queen, which meant she got paid less and sat on horses sideways. To stop persecution, Elizabeth allowed her subjects to practice whatever religion they liked, as long as they pretended to be Church of England when asked, like middle-class people do when they want their kids to go to a posh school. During Elizabeth's reign, British culture flourished, especially the world of theatre, which is sadly still with us to this day.
She has this ongoing joke through all of her videos, and there's a lot I haven't seen yet, but where she trashes theater on a regular basis.
The greatest playwright of the age was Will.I.am Shakespeare. It's often said if Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be sending his scripts to television and film companies. It wouldn't make them because they were so long and boring.
So she's standing there in front of the Globe Theatre, which is a reproduction of the Globe Theatre where Shakespeare's plays would have been originally done, because in 1666 there's this horrible fire that destroys huge parts of old London.
But while audiences thrilled to the tedious drama of Shakespeare's terrible plays, some pioneering Britons were experiencing real drama by going out exploring.
So it's important to note, too, that Shakespeare writes his plays during the Tudor period. So a lot of people consider his plays to be Tudor propaganda. That's what really one of the places where Richard III begins to get eviscerated as this evil hunchback, and that perpetuated for a long, long time. And there's some truth to all of that stuff, right? As is the case with a lot of history. Even when it's propaganda, there's probably some truth to it, but it's been spun with a particular bias for a particular reason.
It was now the British got really into boats, by getting into boats. Sailors of the time were like spacemen, but on water, exploring the unknown, armed only with an engineless wooden car called a boat, and a sort of basic paper sat-nav called a map, which had hardly anything on it, because hardly anything had been found yet.
On maps of the sea, do they show the hills? You know, the little moving hills with the white bit on top?
The waves?
Is that what they call the moving?
I'm impressed that he figured out she was talking about waves, because I couldn't figure out what the heck she was talking about. This guy is one of my favorites that she interviews, because he looks so serious and so stern, but he just rolls with whatever she says.
Hills with the white bits on top.
I think that's what you mean.
Did an explorer ever try to sail into the sky? You know, find a bit of sea that's sort of going up and...
No.
Despite the difficulty, Queen Elizabeth sent a load of sailors over the sea.
She keeps calling her King Queen, but there's actually a speech that she gives to soldiers right around the time of the Spanish Armada, when the Spanish are going to invade England, because Elizabeth, who is fully Protestant as Queen of England, basically the Pope basically gives people carte blanche to invade the country and get rid of the Protestants to restore Catholicism. And there's no greater strong power for Catholicism in Europe than the Spanish. And Mary, Queen Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister, had been married to King Philip of Spain. So she gives this speech, and among other things, she's wearing armor, and she's on her horse, and she says, I may be a woman or a queen, or I don't remember the exact words, but she said, but I have the heart of a king, the heart and stomach of a king, I think she says, and a king of England too. So there's some truth to the whole king-queen thing.
To nick treasure off the Spanish, and then to nick whole countries off whichever brown people were standing on them at the time. The first British explorer to do this was Sir Walter Raleigh.
Sir Walter Raleigh was a great sailor, wasn't he? So why is it today we only remember him for his bikes?
Well, there might have been a connection between that branch of the Raleigh family and the later bike manufacturer, but I very much doubt it. People weren't using cycles of any kind in Sir Walter Raleigh's days.
Oh, really?
I think we really have to accept that Sir Walter Raleigh was just an expert sailor.
Yeah, and he's also the capital of North Carolina is named after him.
Did Sir Walter Raleigh invent the potato?
Well, he didn't invent the potato, in that I don't think anyone actually has ever invented a root vegetable, because they're obviously being cultivated and used by people living in the Americas when he arrived there.
When Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, was he scared of them?
I think that when Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, not that we've any documented records on the moment when he first beheld a potato or a field of potatoes, but I don't think he was scared of them. This is a buccaneer.
My man's got some weird ears, though. Can we acknowledge that? But he does such a great job keeping it serious here. If you ever visit Westminster Abbey, there's a little church on the property that's right next to Westminster Abbey, and you can go in there, and that's where Sir Walter Raleigh is buried. He was beheaded, I think, under King James I, and he's buried in that church. And eventually I'll get it edited, and you'll see the video from my visit to his grave there.
In character, and I think that he probably was able to take on and manage his emotions whilst engaging with potatoes at first sight.
We still celebrate potatoes to this day by buying and eating them. It's amazing to think that Queen Elizabeth was the first British monarch to be impressed by a baked potato, and the last.
Don't bite it. Oh my gosh, she bit the potato.
Walter Raleigh was big news, but he wasn't quite as big news as Sir Francis Drake. This is Drake's ship,
Uncle Francis.
Golden Hind.
All right, I made the video. If you didn't see the video about the drinking game, check that video out. I'll throw it in the link at the end. But Francis Drake is my uncle. I'm descended from, I think, a brother of his.
Which is Tudor for Horse of Gold. It was in this ship Drake became the first person to circumcise the globe, which is probably why this sort of ship is called a clipper. Imagine being on deck in that perilous age. You're in the middle of the ocean, a mighty thunderstorm's brewing. There's a sailor over there, another one over there, the king sailor turning the
king sailor,
the steering wheel thing, potatoes and spare wooden legs rolling around the deck, a seagull up that pole thing.
That pole thing.
Someone reading a treasure map through a telescope.
So I wonder what ship this is, because it's obviously London. You can see the skyline of London in the background. But but I don't remember ever seeing that when I've been in London.
A bloke with a white beard carrying a tray of fish fingers. Pirates, all laughing in that horrible throaty way that they do. And at any moment the prospect that you might just sail off the edge of the world. It's a sobering thought, which they'd have
It's important to note that almost everybody knew the world was round at this point.
needed because they were all pissed to the bollocks on rum. The British's mastery of the oceans made Catholic King Philip of Spain furious in Spanish.
In Spanish.
So he sent his secret weapon to attack England, a woman called Spanish Amanda.
Spanish Amanda, the Spanish Armada, 1588.
The story goes that Drake was playing a leisurely game of bowls on Plymouth Hall when the Spanish attacked. But Drake didn't let the Spanish attack put him off his stroke. He just carried on playing with his bowls. According to records, when he'd finished, Drake changed back into his normal shoes and thrashed the Spaniards. At war, not bowling. England was victorious.
They used fire ships, and they got a lot of help from the weather. A lot of things had to go their way because the English were supremely overmatched in terms of the number of ships and the firepower. But they had a great strategy. They had great help from the weather, and everything kind of worked out for them. And really, the Spanish Armada in 1588, the reason that's talked about so much is because it's really the moment in which there's a huge shift in power, because England has not been one of the supreme great powers of the world at that point. But that's where England starts to become one, and Spain starts to diminish.
Meanwhile, in Scotland, there was another Mary on the scene, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary and Elizabeth were rivals for the throne.
They were also cousins, because, and yeah, rivals for the throne's fair, because if it was true that Elizabeth was disinherited when Henry had his marriage to Anne Boleyn declared null and void, then you could make the argument that Mary Queen of Scots was the heir to the English throne, because she was the next legitimate person in line. She was also Catholic, so there was a lot of reason for Catholics in England to really want Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. Mary was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, and that was where the claim came in.
Catholics loved Mary because they go mad for anyone called Mary. So Elizabeth cut her head off, which made it harder for Mary to take the throne because she could no longer see where it was.
Mary was basically usurped in Scotland by a lot of men who did not want to see her on the throne, and she may have been involved in having her husband killed, and all. It's complicated, but the point is that her very young, very newborn child James is made king, and she really never saw James as he grew up. Unfortunately for her and for the family. But she was held imprisoned for a long time, and eventually there was something called the Babington Plot, which is a plot to overthrow and kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. And Mary may or may not have known about it, but it was enough to condemn her. And Elizabeth acted indignant and shocked when Mary was condemned. She had signed the death warrant, but she claimed that she gave strict instructions for it not to be carried out unless she explicitly said so. It gets carried out, and then she says afterwards that she did not give permission for that. Whether that was the case or whether she was just covering herself for having another anointed monarch killed is another story. But that was kind of the impetus then for the Pope to really get into overdrive and trying to force people to overthrow her.
Elizabeth had ended the rivalry. The final score was 1-0. Elizabeth died without ever marrying, so has gone down in history as the vegan queen.
The vegan queen, the virgin queen. This is Elizabeth and Mary, her sister's grave in Westminster Abbey. And if you look just past there, you see there's this urn right there. You can't really see it, but I'm kind of circling it with my... that is supposedly the urn that contains the bones of the princes in the Tower. These were the brothers. This was King Edward V and his brother Richard of York, who were the brothers of Henry VIII's mother. And the bones were found about 100, I guess it'd be about almost 200 years after the boys disappeared. under some stairs during some renovations at the Tower of London. They've never been tested to see exactly how old they were, whether they could be Edward and Richard. There's hope that maybe King Charles will allow that because his mother would not, and it would require royal permission.
No heirs, which was the olden word for children, making her the season finale of the Tudors. The next top royal was King James.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up right there because I wanted to make this episode specifically about the Tudors. If you have specific videos, because I haven't seen most of these, so I don't know exactly what she covers. Are there specific parts of history that she covers that you'd like me to watch and kind of break down like this? Let me know in the comment section below. I'll throw up some links here at the end to some other videos, including the one from last night about the drinking game. Check it out. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're going to dive back into some PHILOMENA CUNK today. This will be our third time taking a look at clips from her. If you're not familiar with her, she is actually an actress named Diane Morgan who is playing a part of someone who seems to be making serious documentaries about various historic subjects, but she really just comes across as knowing no idea what she's talking about. And I'm told they instruct the historians that she interviews to basically treat her like a child. And the result is pretty funny. So what we're going to do is today we're going to be taking a look at some clips of her talking about American history. And as always, we'll laugh, we'll be entertained, but I'll also try to actually interject with some real history and maybe expound on some of the subjects that she's butchering in the process. So let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Ask a medieval peasant where America was and you'd get a blank look. Or worse still, the plague.
Columbo
What? Or worse still, the plague. So, yeah, the plague is obviously a thing that hits at various times. Some of the worst plague happens, though, in like the 1300s. You have like maybe a third to one half of the European population being wiped out. So by the time America is on the scene in the 1500s, plague is not nearly as big a thing as it was previously, but it's still a killer.
thought that if he sailed off the edge of the map, he'd reappear on the other side like Pac-Man. At first, the European colonists found life in the New World hard. Luckily, some Native Americans taught them how to grow corn and where to fish. In exchange, the colonists introduced the Native Americans to smallpox. After arriving...
All true. The Native Americans did, well, I should say that in some cases they helped, and other times the colonists helped themselves. So, for example, when they landed in what is now Massachusetts and founded the Plymouth colony, they found some of the corn that the natives had hid and buried, and they just helped themselves to it. But yeah, the Native Americans did help them initially, and there were diseases on both sides that got introduced, right? Because a community builds up a tolerance to certain things, and when they've never been exposed to a disease, it's going to ravage them. So smallpox not really being a thing in North America, there's no tolerance built up. So even though it would kill a lot of Europeans, it was worse for the natives. And I believe that syphilis was introduced to Europeans from the native population.
In America to forge a life of honest hard work and toil, many of these colonists quickly discovered they couldn't be arsed. So they stole people from Africa and made them do it instead. What started the tension between the British and the Americans? Was it because you say cookies and we say biscuits, and you say sidewalk and we say pavement? Because I find in a relationship it's those little things that start to grate after a while.
That's true. If you think about it in relationships, there are certain things that you find really cute and really endearing at first, but then eventually they can become really annoying over time. I love some of the differences that we have, and even little things like we're listening to Ed Sheeran's new CD in the car, and he's got a song called Colorblind, which is a fantastic song, but it's got that U in it, the way that the British people spell color, whereas we don't. And some of those things are interesting. Some of them can be really confusing, like soccer, what we call cleats in America, are boots over there, and what we call out of bounds, the Brits call into touch. things like that when it comes to soccer. Just little things like that that it takes some time to get used to.
So, when the people in Boston got angry with the British, why did they just hold a prissy tea party instead of having a proper fight like British men would?
Would you voluntarily, when you didn't have to, go to jail?
It depends what facilities they had, I think. 76, the lead...
So the Boston Tea Party, as she's talking about there, obviously is a protest by Americans, the Sons of Liberty, which is kind of this organization that is formed in the Boston area. They're basically protesting these, what they see as taxation without representation being imposed on the colonies. And Boston is the hotbed where all of this goes down, and this is where the tension gets escalated, and this is where the British crack down the most, and eventually it spreads. But the Boston Tea Party is because the British basically instructed that tea has to be purchased through British companies. They can't import it from somewhere else. And so they dress up as Native Americans, and they go and they basically dump what amounts to $1 million worth of tea into the water.
of the 13 colonies decided that they didn't want to be called British anymore, but Americans.
This straight white supergroup known as the Founding Fathers drafted the most famous breakup text in history, the Declaration of Independence.
And had invented camouflage.
And it's cool that they do that, because if you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, King George's response to what is known as the Olive Branch Petition, which was this last-ditch attempt by the colonies to stave off independence and try to reconcile with the British Crown, he responds to that in a song called You'll Be Back, which is basically his breakup song to America. So it's interesting to hear her describe it that way.
Yet. The British troops of the time wore bright red coats and were consequently shot in their thousands while looking amazing.
Wow,
George
looking
Washington
amazing.
Crossing the Delaware River.
As you can see, he had to stand up for the whole journey because he hadn't reserved a seat. He didn't fall in, but he also didn't help with the rowing.
So this particular painting actually also shows James Monroe, the future president, who we have no evidence if he was on the same boat as Washington, but he was a part of the attack on Trenton.
Washington won, becoming America's first president, the single most revered role in the world, until 2016.
Meaning when Donald Trump was elected. I think we've had others as well that maybe people didn't look so highly at.
I read somewhere that America isn't just a country, but an idea. But it is just a country, isn't it? Having a sandwich, that's an idea. Painting your bicycle blue, that's an idea. Going, that's an idea. America is just a place.
She's taking it up a notch on this one. Just I just try to put myself in the shoes of these historians that she's interviewing. These are like serious academic people. These are people who are all about teaching history, and having this woman come along, it would be fun. I think it would actually be a lot of fun to try and kind of keep up with her, and I'm sure these people have to know what they're getting into.
They believed in something called manifest destiny, the belief that all the land belonged to them, and that God wanted them to go west and claim it back from the Native Americans he put there first by mistake.
He'd put there first by mistake. 100% true. Manifest destiny is this idea that honestly, even though it maybe wasn't described that way at the time, is one of the unspoken motivations behind the American Revolution. And I've talked about this before, but you've got the Appalachian Mountains, which run basically the whole length of the eastern coast. And they were kind of the western boundary of the colonies at the time. Well, there's a lot of land on the other side of those mountains, but the British government had agreements in place with the Native American tribes that they weren't going to settle in that area. They would send trappers and traders and things like that. But the American colonists saw all that land, And you see that in the aftermath of the revolution, that there's this massive expansion all the way to the Mississippi River, because a lot of this land was given as land grants to soldiers for their service in the revolution. So places like Kentucky and Ohio and Tennessee get massively settled. And this is the beginning stages of Manifest Destiny, the idea that America is destined, and some people said, yeah, by God, to own everything all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Testing your destiny was dangerous. You had to trundle across a perilous landscape in a rickety wagon on the brink of starvation or shitting yourself to death with dysentery, getting bitten by snakes or butchered by Apaches. Almost as if God didn't want them to do this after all.
That's actually a really solid point to make, right? If you believe it's your destiny that God ordained for you to do this, but you're constantly running into death and destruction and starvation and illness and all these things, it might cause you to second guess whether it was the right idea. I think the number is something like 10% of people who set out on the journey on like the Oregon Trail died before they made it. So the vast majority of people did make it.
But Americans back then weren't the humble, unassuming people they still aren't today. It's hard to imagine a world where Edison didn't invent the light bulb. And even if you did imagine it, it would be too dark to see what was in it. So we had daylight during the day and we had candles at night.
Yes.
So we didn't need light bulbs. His life's work was meaningless. That must have been a real moment the first time someone realised a plane needed a toilet. That's more impressive than the Wright brothers. Use of firearms is an integral...
Just random clips that we're seeing here, but interesting stuff. Now we're going to talk about guns.
Part of their national identity. How come Americans have the right to kill anyone they want with a gun?
Well, they don't. Murder is illegal in the United States, but they do have the right to own weapons.
They have the right to bear arms.
Correct.
But bears don't have arms.
They do, actually.
Oh, do they?
Yes.
I thought they were legs.
Well, I'm not a biologist, but I suppose that when they stand up, they're probably arms.
With its cowboys and guns and steam train rides, America became known as the land of the free, which must have come as a surprise to all the slaves.
Wow, that was dark, and it is so true. I mean, the hypocrisy of Americans in the 1770s fighting for their freedom while a third of the country is systematically denying freedom to an entire group of people is impossible to overlook.
But by finally thinking hard about the subject, the people of the northern states made a horrifying discovery. That inside each slave was an actual human person. Abraham Lincoln was shot in the theatre box, wasn't he? Where is that on the body?
Oh, I think...
And why was he shot? Was it because he wouldn't take his hat off? Because that's quite annoying in the theatre, isn't it, when someone's in front of you with a hat on?
Well, he was in the...
How did being shot in the head affect Lincoln's ability to lead?
Well, it ended it because he died about 12 hours after he was shot.
So he couldn't carry on?
He couldn't, no. Not as a corpse, unfortunately.
Not as a corpse. He's just going right along with this like it's nothing at all. It's fantastic. And there was nobody sitting behind Lincoln. Lincoln and his wife were in a box with Major Henry Rathbone and his... I don't know if she was a girlfriend or fiance by this point. He eventually married her. Her name was Clara Harris. And he actually ended up murdering her years later. But originally it was supposed to be Ulysses S. Grant and his wife. But a couple of things. Grant wanted to go home and see his kids. They lived in New Jersey, real close to Philadelphia and at the time. And also his wife didn't particularly care for Mrs. Lincoln because like a lot of other military wives, she had had encounters with Mrs. Lincoln that left her with a less than favorable impression. Mrs. Lincoln was already dealing with mental illness that would only get worse after her husband was killed, and then she lost a third son when her son Tad died.
Why don't bicycles have toilets? You know, it would save you having to get off. I might write that down and copyright it. Even without a toilet, the Wright brothers' historic flight changed transportation forever in ways that still aren't fully understood. The Wright brothers did the first proper flight over 100 years ago. How come we're still not any closer to working out how aeroplanes actually work? That's your theory. Do you want to hear my theory?
Okay.
I think they run on belief. It's just because we believe planes can fly that they do. So the media has to keep up the pretense, or they're just going to start dropping out of the sky.
They run on belief. As an Ohioan, I always have to point out that the Wright brothers were from Ohio. They're from Dayton. They weren't from North Carolina. A lot of people seem to think they're from North Carolina because that's where they did their flight.
But Abraham Lincoln's story didn't have a happy ending. 5 days after the North won, a terrible fate befell him. He was forced to go to the theatre to watch a play. He was put out of his misery by a kindly gunman, but cruelly, not until the third act.
Not until the third act. So the play's called Our American Cousin. And specifically, because here's the thing about this is, you know, John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He's not as big an actor as his brother Edwin Booth, who might be one of the most popular actors in America. But Booth's very well known. He's well recognized, and he actually would receive his mail at Ford's Theater when he was in town. And so it wasn't a really huge deal for people to see John Wilkes Booth walking around the theater. That's why he could get away with this, and he could get away with sneaking up toward where the president's box was. And he goes up there, and he knows the play, so he's actually waiting for this one particular laugh line, so it'll kind of muffle the sounds of him firing. And the line specifically is, this guy says something like, "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap." And everybody laughs, and that's when Booth fires. And then, of course, he famously jumps, and they say that the spurs that are on his boots from riding the horse catch on a flag on his way down, and he breaks his leg. And he ends up having to get that leg set by this Dr. Samuel Mudd, who actually gets sentenced to life in prison for helping Booth, and that was later commuted. But interesting story. The whole thing's very fascinating. All right, so we're going to wrap it up right there with those clips on Kunk talking about American history. Big thank you to all of our patrons for your continued support. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to take a little break from our series looking at the English Civil War. I'm going to be back from Gettysburg in a few days, and we'll pick up right where we left off with that. In the meantime, before I head to Gettysburg, I'm going to leave you with a little bit more Philomena Cunk. If you haven't seen my other episodes where I've done reactions to some of her stuff, I'll put links in the description. There's also a playlist of those. Her name's Diane Morgan. She's an actress playing a role, playing kind of someone who doesn't really understand history. It's all a spoof. It's hilarious. It's fun. It's not for everyone, and I get that. And so what I'm going to do, as I've done with the other episodes that I've reacted to, is we're going to laugh, we're going to have some fun, be entertained, but I'm also going to try to inject some real history into there and give a little bit of background into what they are talking about. So in this episode, we are going to watch the first part of the third episode of Kunk on Britain. I believe this is talking about the Industrial Revolution. Haven't watched it yet, but I did kind of just look through to see what this episode was about, and I think about the first 12 minutes or so are about the Industrial Revolution and kind of the early part of the Victorian era. So I'll put the link down in the description to the original content if you want to check it out. I believe this is on Netflix, but I don't know if this particular one's on Netflix. I know some of her stuff is. So let's check it out.
Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back. What actually is it? Who are we, and why?
I'm assuming that she's saying now we've got our country back. She's talking about Brexit, and I'll just leave that right there.
The best way to find out where Britain's heading is to look behind us into something called history, a sort of rear-view mirror.
So just because I've been to some of these places, and listen, I haven't been many places in the UK yet, but I'm pretty sure that this one was Edinburgh in Scotland.
The best way to find...
I'm almost positive that's Edinburgh. That's the hill walking down the Royal Mile. Pretty sure that's where that is. And then I think the next one's Birmingham.
Is to look behind.
Pretty sure that's one of the, if you ever watched Peaky Blinders, you see the the canals a lot in Birmingham. Birmingham's got more canals than, like, what's the city in Italy? Venice.
Behind us into something called history, a sort of rear view mirror for time. So that's where I'm going, back there.
It's a journey that'll take me the length and width of the country. On my odyssey, I'll be starting sentences in one location
And finishing them in another.
Love it.
and looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them. If Shelley's one of the greatest poets in English literature, how come nobody gives a shit about him today?
That's a complicated question.
And it's not just a story of things.
Nelson.
It's also a story of people sitting or standing on things. All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
The United Britain of Great Kingdom. I love it. United Kingdom of Great Britain. We've talked before about the difference between the UK and Britain and all that kind of stuff.
Kong Kong Britain.
Dover.
Last time, we saw how the British leaked out of Britain itself and sailed the world in boats.
This week we're examining the 19th century.
This was a time of...
I think that scene, I haven't been there yet, but it's right where my family's from, and I've been past it. There's this place called the Black Country Living Museum, and I'm definitely going to go there the next time I'm in the UK. I'm planning on going some point to get to a West Brom game during this next upcoming season. And while I'm there, I want to get to the Black Country Living Museum, shoot some video, because it's basically like this place where you can go and experience what life was like in the heart of the Industrial Revolution in a place like the Black Country, which is outside of Birmingham, where a lot of the Industrial Revolution really took hold. I think that's where that was filmed. I'm sure that's where that is.
This was a time of invention, industry, discovery, empire building, urban squalor, sexual hypocrisy, optimism, statues, painting, photograph, him, her, them and tree. It was a time when British creativity was at its peak, bringing us everything from great works of art to great works of train. A time when Britain very much entered the third episode of its history.
And yeah, it's important to, episode 3, the third episode, it's important to recognize that the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution really is the UK. I mean, it's happening other places too, but nowhere near to the degree of what it's happening in the UK in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It's just incredible. The steam engine, the locomotive, I mean, amazing stuff.
It's the early 19th century, and Britain is in the grip of the Georgian era, a time when all English kings had to be called George. There was George III, George II, George IV, and George I.
So yeah, the Hanover dynasty begins with George I. We've been talking about Prince Rupert in the series on the English Civil War. His sister Sophia, her son is Georg Ludwig, who becomes the Elector of Hanover. If Sophia had lived a few months longer, she would have become the queen. But she dies right before her cousin Queen Anne. So when Queen Anne dies, the throne goes to George I, who doesn't speak any English and really doesn't care to even be in England. His son George II, who is a native German speaker because he grows up in Germany, but does learn English. And this is one of the reasons why you have a prime minister become such an important role, is because George I really just can't speak English and can't really be bothered to learn. And so Robert Walpole, I'm giving the disappointed dad face, if you know, you know. Robert Walpole is kind of running the country on his behalf. George II learns English but doesn't get along well with his father. And again, he's really more drawn to Hanover. And then his son, I believe, is Frederick, but Frederick dies before his father, George II, and so then it's George II's grandson, George III, who takes the throne, rules for 60 years. His son, George IV, is Prince Regent for a while when George is having his mental health issues. And then after George IV dies, his brother William IV takes the throne, and then their brother's daughter becomes Queen Victoria.
Not necessarily in that order.
The Georgian era saw the birth of a new artistic movement. the Romantics. They weren't like the old Romantics, which is like when your dad buys your mum a box of black magic from the service station when it isn't even her birthday. And they weren't like the new Romantics, which were all synthesizers and wind machines. Instead, they were poets and artists whose names are still familiar today. Wordsworth, Shelley, Blake, and the other ones.
And the other ones.
To find out more, I went to speak to an expert.
Who was Ron?
Among the Romantics, you mean?
Yeah.
So, if you're not familiar with Philomena Cunk, my understanding, and several people have confirmed this to me, is that they know, the experts that she's interviewing, they know that this is all a spoof, but they don't know what the questions are going to be. And so there's still that kind of element of surprise for them, but they roll with it so well. I'd love to see the outtakes.
William Godwin was quite wrong. He believed that there should be no laws at all in society.
No, who's Ron?
Ron? Is there a Ron?
Yeah, the one that wrote all the poems and signed them by Ron.
Yeah, that was his family name, Byron. Lord George Byron.
Oh, right, okay.
He's buried at Westminster Abbey.
Who was the man from Nantucket that Byron wrote
No,
about in his
no,
poem?
let's not go there.
I don't remember that.
I think he was American
It's
anyway.
the one that goes, there was a young man from Nantucket.
Is that Byron?
Don't continue.
I think so.
Don't say the rest. This is family
How
friendly.
did it end?
Byron was like a rock star. He was sexy like Mick Jagger, brooding like Kurt Cobain, and he had brown hair like Harry Styles. Little wonder he's still considered the #1 dead romantic in history. Which was your favourite of the Romantics?
Probably Byron, I would think. Byron was the bad boy of the Romantic poets. It's thought that he probably slept with his sister and with most other women in England.
He was your
And with most other women in England? Wait, he didn't really... Gotta look this up. Okay, so his half-sister, Augusta Lee, rumors of incest surrounded the pair. Augusta's daughter, Medora, was suspected to have been Byron's child. To escape from growing debts and rumors, Byron pressed in his determination to marry Annabella, who was said to be the likely heiress of a rich uncle. They got married, but his continuing obsession with Augusta Lee, his half-sister, made their marital life a misery. I can't imagine why his wife had a problem with the fact that he was sleeping with his half-sister. Holy cow, I did not know that. That's crazy.
favourite?
Yeah.
The one who slept with his sister?
Well, it's not on that basis that I like him. I was just giving you a bit of background on him.
I'm so glad he clarified that it's not because he slept with his sister that he likes Byron.
People, or was everyone sleeping with a sister back then?
I think it was, I mean, he spent much of his life in exile. And
Where's exile?
Well, in his case, it was in Italy mainly. And he wrote Don Juan, which is one of the greatest pieces of particularly rhyming poetry in English literature.
It must be a good book if you can overlook the fact he slept with his sister. But not all women of the age were Byron's sister who he was sleeping with. Some of them were other women, like this one. What exactly was Jane Austen?
Jane Austen was a woman from Hampshire who wrote novels.
Is that it?
Yes, that's it, absolutely.
Austen wrote novels, which are books, which look like this on the outside and this on the inside, filled with words it's almost impossible to care about. When are they going to translate Jane Austen's books into proper English? You know, from like ancient English? Because they're sort of hard to concentrate on, aren't they, now that we've got like phones and stuff?
Well, she's not that hard, really. The sentences have sometimes got some nice balancing clauses with a lot of humour in them.
Why do they keep making Jane Austen's books into films and TV shows? There's only about 5 of them, isn't there? Whereas, like, there's 50 Mr. Men books and they haven't done all of those yet.
I think there are lots of reasons for that. People love
He's
the
trying
love
hard.
stories.
He's trying to roll with it.
They like the costumes. They're also wonderful books with lots
Yeah, Jane Austen, I know there's a lot of people out there right now that are really into the whole Bridgerton phenomenon, which I've got my issues with that, but like my wife, among others, really loves it, so whatever. But that's kind of that same sort of thing, right? The Jane Austen novels kind of capture that time period, that romanticism, that kind of upper class love story thing that you have going on there.
Lots of opportunities for humour.
Are we talking about Jane Austen or Mr. Man?
Probably both.
Yeah. Who's your favourite Mr. Man?
Mr. Tickle, probably.
Yeah, love Mr. Tickle. Jane Austen died in 1817, only to be reincarnated 200 years later in the form of this banknote. But important though she wasn't the most significant woman of the century.
See, I really wish that here in the United States we would get a little more creative with who we put on the money. We do not always have to have the same people on the money, especially when those same people are people like Andrew Jackson. You know, there's so many amazing Americans that have lived throughout time that we could be putting on money, and we could change it up every so often.
That honour belonged to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is often portrayed as old and grumpy. It's where the term Victoria Cross comes from. But she wasn't always a sour, disapproving old woman.
That is not where Victoria Cross comes from. Victoria Cross is the British Empire equivalent of the Medal of Honor that we have here in the United States. And it was called the Victoria Cross because it was first issued during her reign. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, she's a teenager when she comes to the throne when her uncle William IV dies. 1837, I think she comes to the throne, so she's like 18 or had just turned 18 or wasn't quite 18 yet, and really asserts herself at a time when there were a lot of people in her life who were really trying to dominate her, but she didn't let that happen.
She was once a sour, disapproving baby. Queen Victoria was born in 1819 in the usual way, out of a woman. It was hard to tell that this infant would grow up to be queen because her crown hadn't yet formed. It was just hair, which must have been a relief to her mother as she was pushing her out. As well as looking miserable, her other hobby was fashion. Even at an early age, she was dressing like a cross between a disillusioned Lord Mayor and an angry hen. In 1837, aged 18, Victoria became queen. Her reign was to be a period of great industrial, cultural, scientific and political change.
Yeah, she's on the throne from 1837 till 1901, until the most recent queen that just passed away was the longest reigning monarch. And it's amazing to think that 3 of the longest reigning monarchs in British history were women who have become 3 of the greats. And think about going back to 1760. You have George III, who's king for 60 years, from 1760 to 1820. Then you got a 17-year period in there with 2 kings, George IV and William IV. Then you've got another 60-plus year period with Victoria, followed by, 9 years for her son, 26 years for George V, less than a year for Edward VIII, and then you've got only 16 years for George VI. And then Queen Elizabeth from 1952 all the way up until last year. So long stretches where people's entire lives are lived with one monarch.
But the main thing people asked her about was why she was still single and when she was getting married.
She married her cousin.
Eventually, to shut everyone up, she fell in love with her cousin Albert. Prince Albert
and not just cousin, they were first cousins. They had parents who were siblings to each other. Pretty common thing.
German, but Victoria was willing to overlook that because they were in love and because most of her family were German too. Their untrammelled sexual passion is evident in every photograph of them. What no one saw coming.
That's the way they posed, but from all indications, she was deeply devoted to him. They were very much in love, and when he died, I think in 1861, died pretty young. They'd only been married for like 20 years. She was devastated, and she basically presented herself as in mourning for the last 40 years of her life.
Was that during Victoria's reign, Britain would be turned upside down by an avalanche of hurricane proportions called progress. This was the Industrial Revolution.
Now, understand the revolution, the Industrial Revolution has already been well underway during this time. And it's not just industrial. There's farming revolutions taking place too. I'm currently writing a book on the Greenhill family, which is one of my families that I'm descended from who lived in Birmingham. And they start out as farmers, but then they move into the city. They live in the jewelry quarter, become gun makers and gilt toy manufacturers. And there's a lot of, as I'm doing research, there's a lot of farming revolution that's happening as well, as far as being able to make better use of the work hours and the labor that it takes to farm.
The very first winds of that change quake detonated in the almost prehistoric world of transport. The Victorians had horse-drawn buses, but you never see horses drawing anything these days, do you? When did they lose the ability to draw? Is it when their hands sort of turned into hooves?
When we talk about horse-drawn buses, we're not really talking about horses drawing buses, but pulling them along. So that's the meaning of.
Again, I just love how they just roll with it like it was a serious question and just go with it.
Draw
it's great.
In this instance. And that stopped really once we had the railways and then even more the engines.
Engines ran on a mysterious new element the Victorians had discovered called steam.
It was a big deal, wasn't it, when they got trains to run on steam?
Where did they get the steam that powered the trains back then? Did they have to sort of mine it from underground, or did they get it from the sky?
Well, you can actually make steam by boiling water. So what they're doing is using the coal to boil the water and make the steam that way.
And boiler technology is still used to this day, right? Our church has boilers that are used to heat the church. But what they did was they were able to, this is not the first time steam power has ever been used, right? People have always understood that was something that could be done. It was a matter of harnessing it in such a way that it could be used practically and being able to make the engines small enough to where you could have these trains. Think about what a revolution trains are. For all of human existence, they've had to use vehicles that were either pulled by horses or that were powered by wind on the ocean, but to be able to move large amounts of materials and haul them from one place to another on trains is a massive revolution.
Right, so clouds are made of boiling water. Why don't planes boil then when we fly through them?
She doesn't know where to go with that one.
Speak to a meteorologist about the clouds.
Perfect response.
As well as carrying steam, trains could move people huge distances, and they work much harder and faster than horses. And unlike horses, they've got a big smiley face on the front, and the
Thomas the Tank Engine.
Staff.
Soon the inevitable happened, and mankind bred with trains, creating half-human, half-trained super-engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who kicked the Industrial Revolution into overdrive. Why is Brunel...
You should know, too, that with the invention of trains come a massive amount of deaths because of trains. Gosh, the number of families I've researched who had family members killed by trains, the number of people in my own family that were killed by trains. 2 brothers killed within 5 years of each other the exact same way by being hit by a train while they were walking along the tracks. It took a while for people to adjust to the fact that there were these large moving objects that could hit you and kill you quickly.
Considered one of the greatest Britons of all time.
Brunel built so many different things, towns, canals, bridges. I mean, he was responsible for many of the things that happened during the Industrial Revolution. He really took our country forward in terms of technological progress.
Where does he rank compared to, say, Nick Knowles?
He's definitely further up the list, on my list.
Nick Knowles or Brunel?
Brunel.
I suppose we haven't given Nick Knowles a proper chance yet, have we? We don't know what he might come up with yet.
I don't even know who Nick Knowles is.
Brunel's most famous achievements, the Clifton Suspension Bridge, Britain's first white knuckle ride.
That is a beautiful bridge. I wonder when that was built. So it's finished in the 1860s. That is impressive technology. It's a pretty big bridge, and it holds like I guess they have about 9,000 vehicles a day go across that thing. Nice.
Although disappointingly flat compared to today's roller coasters, millions still flock to Bristol every year just to queue up and have a go on it. As well as bridges and tunnels,
£1
the
to
Industrial
cross.
Revolution brought factories. Factories were cavernous holes of noise and machinery, dirty and dangerous environments without even basic Wi-Fi, and only...
So when you start having these big factories manufacturing with large numbers of people, right, it's going to take a while for the laws and the regulations to catch up to the technology. And so you're going to have a lot of coal mining disasters, and you're going to have things like the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in the United States, where because things are happening that have never happened before in larger numbers with new technology, it's going to take a while, and it's going to take, unfortunately, some really bad things happening for people to realize that regulations need to happen and change needs to happen, right? It takes the Titanic, for example, sinking for there to be a law that says that ships have to have enough lifeboats for all their passengers. It takes fires happening and people not being able to get out for them to come up with laws about fire codes and how doors have to swing out so that people can get out easier. And, those kinds of things. Unfortunately, that's the way those things end up happening.
in the most rudimentary breakout spaces, but they were changing Britain forever. These days, no one works in these factories except ghosts, and even then, they only work night shifts. Workers did long, thankless hours with no breaks and low pay in a squalid and threatening environment.
The 40-hour work week, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week is non-existent at this point. That is not even a glint in the eye of people. When I was doing research for the book I wrote on my Whitaker family, which they were steel workers, iron workers, puddlers in the Birmingham area and then later on in Glasgow, they were typically working 6 days a week, 72 hours a week, like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week shifts, and not making a ton of money, but making a decent living so long as you were working the 70 hours a week. It was grueling, and your lifespan was short. A lot of these iron puddlers died of bronchitis, died of lung issues in their 50s and 60s.
Conditions unthinkable today to anyone who isn't a junior doctor. The Industrial Revolution was so frenetic, a man called Charles Babbage got carried away and invented the computer far too early. Modern computers are tiny, but this was as big as a transit van. It was even bigger than the 1990s one your dad's got in the loft and won't throw away in case the bin men find all his bank details and mucky JPEGs.
Hello, who are you?
I'm Doran Swade.
Hello,
I'm
who
an
are
historian
you?
of computing.
Dude's got an MBE, and she's like, who are you?
And I was responsible for building this engine.
So what games does it have?
It doesn't have any games.
It must have like some basic games like Mario Kart or Snake or
I'm afraid
or
not.
Patience, like
Nope.
the shittest one. It must have Patience.
I'm afraid it doesn't.
It doesn't have any games.
None
So what's it
whatever.
do?
It just does mathematical
There
calculation.
you go.
So where's the screen on this computer?
A screen, again, is part of the electronic era. This has no screens. As it happens, you don't need to read the numbers because it prints them automatically for you.
It's a shame, isn't it? that
Pretty
it-
incredible technology when you think about what Babbage came up with. And this is a forerunner to the stuff that you see in the Imitation Game, that Alan Turing's working on. And so just like with everything else, the modern computer is built on hundreds of years of other people's work and research that has been done over time.
Doesn't have a screen because then you could turn it upside down and the numbers would become rude words. Like with a calculator.
Yes.
Have you ever done that?
I haven't, but I know what you mean.
You've done this, but you haven't done that.
Correct.
She shakes her head
Never
at him.
foresaw the terrible consequences of his invention. A machine that would auto-correct his name to Cabbage every single time.
That's,
The Victorian
yes, again,
age.
that's definitely got to be the Black Country Living Museum. I've so got to get there.
Was an era of huge and inventive leaps.
But one man was about to take too large a step for many. Charles Darwin.
All right, so we're going to stop there because we're getting away from the Industrial Revolution, getting into evolution, stuff like that. We'll cover that one another time. Let me know your thoughts. Is there a particular part of Philomena Cunk's stuff that you want me to do a reaction to? Let me know in the comment section below. Hope you guys had fun with that. Something a little lighthearted, but gives us a chance to talk about some real history. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into some more of Philomena Cunk. So if you're not familiar with Philomena Cunk, it's actually a character played by an actress named Diane Morgan, and she basically puts this on as like a spoof on history. And my understanding is that these real historians that she is interviewing, they know that it's a comedy show, but they don't necessarily know what questions she's going to ask. So their reactions are their best attempts at being real in those situations. So I don't know exactly what clips we're going to be dealing with here. We're just doing some highlights. As always, what I'm going to do is we're going to laugh and we're going to have fun and we're going to be entertained. But I'll be the serious guy and try to offer some real historical feedback to the things that they are talking about, if it's stuff I know about, which I expect that I'll know a little something about the things they're covering. So, if you want to check it out, go to Netflix, go to BBC channels if you have streaming services that have BBC. A lot of great Philomena Cunk stuff out there. I know there's a whole new series on Netflix that just went up, so check that stuff out for sure. Let's dive in.
Who are you?
I'm Ian Borden. I'm a professor of architecture at University College London.
What is a building?
A building is anything that anyone has built.
So my shoes are a building. How many three wise men were there?
Who knows?
How many three wise men were there? Well, obviously, we're dealing with the Bible. We're talking about magi. They were never called wise men, called magi. And it never says there are three of them. It only says there are three gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Could have been 20 of them. Could have been 2 of them. There are stories that have been written down that include their names and things like that, but those are extra biblical sources. We really don't know for sure how many there were.
And I
don't understand.
And I should mention too, and this is a pet peeve of mine, is that when people have the wise men, the magi, in their nativity scenes, no, the Bible says they came to a house where Jesus and his family were staying sometime after he was born. Could have been 2 weeks, could have been a year later. Wasn't at the manger scene.
And bread sauce.
It's a great way of making a really savoury sauce.
Bread and sauce are 2 completely different things, aren't they?
Well, they are, but you can grind the bread down and then cook it in milk to make a really good sauce.
It just looks like sort of...
He's doing so well at just kind of going with it. I love it.
Cheers.
He doesn't know where to go with this one.
When Henry died, Edward became king, aged just 9 years old.
Edward died aged 15, the youngest anyone had ever died of old age. When you...
The youngest anyone had ever died of old age. So Henry VIII's whole thing was about having a son, right, that he could pass the throne on to, and he goes through his first 2 wives, Catherine of Aragon and then Anne Boleyn, and both of them each only give him a daughter who actually will become queen someday. Catherine of Aragon's the mother of Queen Mary, who we know as Bloody Mary. Anne Boleyn's the mother of Elizabeth I. And then Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, is going to give him that long-awaited legitimate son. He had an illegitimate son. But yeah, Edward VI is only going to live for a short time, then the throne's going to pass to his sister Mary.
Teach your kids Shakespeare.
And before any of you say anything, I know that in there for a while is Lady Jane Grey, but you can count her or not count her as actually being queen.
Did their heads grow physically bigger?
No.
It's comforting, isn't it, to realise we don't have nuclear weapons these days?
Well, it depends who you mean by we. The British have got nuclear weapons and have recently indeed decided to increase the number of warheads that...
So, I think this was one that was in the last video we did of hers. Yeah, in fact, let's take a look at the map of who all has nuclear weapons or we believe to have nuclear weapons. So, Russia's estimated to have about 6,000 of them. United States has about 5,400 of them. China, 350. France, UK, Pakistan, and India. That's a real dangerous powder keg there. Israel, probably 90. North Korea's got 20 to 43 of them. And then, of course, there are countries that host nuclear weapons in other countries. So Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands all have nuclear weapons within their countries. And it says here that one nuclear weapon over New York City would, and they are detonated over, they don't hit the ground, they're detonated over top of, would cause an estimated nearly 600,000 fatalities. And of course, it depends on the yield of the nuclear weapon, how many megatons it is. Would determine. So if you drop like the Tsar Bomba, which is the largest nuclear weapon that's ever been detonated, it would be significantly worse. But nobody's got Tsar Bombas sitting around that they can launch on ICBMs or anything like that.
That they possess.
Yep, yeah, but they're blanks, aren't they? They're full of blanks.
No, not at all. No. These are fully capable missile systems with nuclear warheads. Many other states have them.
She's going to cry.
That nuclear war and the threat of nuclear destruction.
And I shouldn't be laughing about this because nuclear weapons, it's a scary thing, but it's still funny.
With us.
She's doing so good with this. And he's just
Right, can we talk about something a bit more cheerful?
Anything you like.
Do you like ABBA?
I love ABBA.
Yeah.
Dude, there's ABBA. There's this ongoing theme, at least in the videos I saw on Netflix, where they, every so often, they'll go back and refer to things like ABBA.
When a feminist looks in the mirror, do they see an equal woman or a better woman?
They quite often, like all of us, look for what they want to see and they look for what they hope to see.
You see yourself back to front, don't you, in a mirror? But not upside down. Why is that?
Well, hopefully, because that's the way that mirrors are designed.
I have so much admiration for these historians that are just going with the flow with her and being good sports about it. It is interesting to note that when our eyes process light into their eyes and images, they do process them upside down and then our brains flip it around.
What power's a mirror? Sorry, you're not the mirrors expert, are you?
You're not the mirrors expert.
Insult to injury, that money will most likely have a picture of a man on it because most banknotes don't have women on them, apart from the Queen, who's on all of them.
Who's on all of them? So I believe that is the statue that is out front of Buckingham Palace, which is a really cool place to visit. I know it's a touristy thing to do, but it's a pretty cool place to visit if you ever go to London.
Maybe one day, human beings won't need buildings anymore.
And I should mention here, too, if you ever go to London, boy, there's so much history right in this spot here, right? So the Tower of London's right here. You got the HMS Belfast, which I did do a video about, and eventually I'll get to editing it and put it up for you. Tower Bridge is right here. That is not London Bridge. London Bridge is the next one down. It's just a plain-looking bridge at this point.
Although, for that to happen, we'd probably need to evolve skins made of bricks. And that might take at least another 30 years. Macbeth is startled at dinner by the unexpected appearance of Banquo's ghost, played here for some reason by the letter H.
Which of you have done this?
But what
Played by the letter H. So, okay.
was so great about Henry VIII? Why is he the king we all still remember, unlike, say, Richard V? Well, for one...
We don't remember Richard V because there hasn't been one. There's only been 3 Richards, and I don't think anybody wanted to take on the name of Richard after Richard III because of how... Richard II, actually, honestly, none of the Richards were very good. Richard I, everybody remembers him, he's the Lionheart, but he spent 6 months of his reign in England, the rest of it outside the country, nearly bankrupted the country, paying his, getting his ransom paid when he was captured. Richard II was deposed as king, and that eventually leads to the Wars of the Roses. And then Richard III, of course, we all remember him. He loses at the Battle of Bosworth, defeated by Henry Tudor.
He was fat, so he takes up more room in the memory.
So the Andromeda Galaxy is going to hit us.
The Andromeda Galaxy? A whole galaxy is going to hit us?
Yeah. On about the same time scale, actually.
So could we fall down a black hole?
Yeah, you could fall into one.
Is that the same? Because I heard that you could be, if, you know, this is one way that the world could end, is that we're all just sucked off through a hole.
Sucked off through a hole. Andromeda's the nearest galaxy to us, and it's pretty cool. You know, if you've got a decent telescope and you've got a camera hooked up to it, you can take pictures of these galaxies. Every star that you see in the sky with the naked eye is in the Milky Way. That's just the way it works.
I mean, that must be terrible. Can you imagine what it would feel like to be sucked off through a hole?
Yeah.
Back in Queen Victorian times, women weren't allowed to vote, even though we had a female king. So some women formed a gang called the Suffrage.
Even though we had a female king. Queen Victoria is queen from 1837 to 1901. It's a time of a lot of reforms. There are a lot of voting reforms that take place during that time. And voting is given to a lot of new people in the UK. But yeah, women don't get to vote until later. And it was at times pretty violent, the women's suffrage movement in England. In fact, at one point, I believe it was women suffragettes who detonate a bomb that damages the Stone of Scone, which is that stone of destiny that is in Scotland now, but they'll have under the coronation chair when King Charles is crowned in a couple weeks.
Suffragettes. 1 in 20 people has been a victim of crime, which means that 19 out of 20 people are criminals. No wonder we need police.
No wonder we need. Okay.
Over the centuries, many things have been used as money, including amber, wheat, eggs, travellers' checks, feathers, book vouchers, lobsters, beads, gold, leather, nectar points, rice, peas, mugs and money. It was only the last of these that caught on. It's almost unbelievable that before Charles Darwin invented evolution in 1859...
Before Charles Darwin invented evolution. And really cool, if you go to Westminster Abbey, there's this section of, you know, because there's all these famous people that are buried in Westminster Abbey, but there's one little section. You got like Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton and, oh gosh, why am I drawing a blank on his name? The guy who had ALS. Stephen Hawking. All of them are buried real close to each other. And then, you know, just, it's really, really neat just to see how much history is there.
Without him, none of us would be here today, except in the form of fossils or gibbons. This is the National Theatre. It's designed to look so horrible that people are glad to be inside watching boring plays. Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back. What actually is it? Who are we, and why? You know when you read a word in a book, and you sort of hear that word in your head, how do they get the sounds into the ink to make it play in your head?
Well,
if I was the historian in that case, I wouldn't even know where to go with that. It is interesting, though, that the way we read Shakespeare today is not necessarily how it would have sounded, because the pronunciation of some of those words have changed. So it's really fascinating to listen to people reading Shakespeare as it would have sounded at the time that it was written, you know, the early 1600s when these Shakespeare plays were becoming popular.
He wrote, "The world to an end will come in 1881, a claim which has recently been debunked by experts through a careful process of looking around and seeing the world still here." Today, some people choose to turn the outside of their homes into a giant advent crown. A jolly house covered in electric lights may be expensive and use a lot of power, but it's the perfect way to cheer up a world worried about climate change and dwindling resources. Queen Elizabeth I got a crown screwed on here in Westminster Abbey.
See what? Say Westminster?
It was in this ship Drake became the first person to circumcise the globe, which is...
To circumcise the globe. To circumnavigate the globe. Yeah, because, you know, we usually talk about, who was it, Magellan doing that, but he didn't make it because he died during his journey.
Probably why this sort of ship is called a clipper. People genuinely believed witches were amongst them. Their fear fueled by leaked photos like this.
Leaked
Did
photos.
Did an explorer ever try to sail into the sky? You know, find a bit of sea that's sort of going up and...
No.
We're often told to feel sorry for those who are alone at Christmas, but these days that's all of us, and it's brilliant. Why did Nelson always have one hand up his jumper? What was he doing up there?
He'd lost most of his right arm, so...
The pagans
Yeah, it's quite something when we talk about Horatio Nelson, one of the great heroes, obviously, of the United Kingdom, wins that victory at Trafalgar, but is killed during that victory. I mean, there's not very often that you have heroes in their greatest hour of triumph dying in that moment, but it does happen.
Celebrated the solstice by cutting down holly and ivy and dragging it into their homes, along with a giant Yule log which they'd set fire to. It sounds rubbish, but with no app store to speak of, killing trees and plants was as good as entertainment got, even at Christmas. Despite being the stuff of nightmares, Santa is the world's most popular home intruder.
Home intruder. And that particular Santa mask was the stuff of nightmares, I'll give you that. Does anybody remember the Burger King commercials where they had the guy dressed as the Burger King and people would just be going about their day and you'd look over and you'd see him like peeking out from behind a tree? That was the stuff of nightmares.
But at Christmas 1914, there was a brief ceasefire. The fighting stopped. Soldiers got out of their holes and joined together in a place called No Man's Land, showing that even at moments of peace, men will still divide into two sides and try to beat one another.
Yeah, there were games of football that took place during that Christmas truce. And if you want to learn more about the Christmas truce, I did a podcast episode on that, and I'll also throw up a link on the screen here to my video from one of the sites in Belgium where we know the Christmas truce took place, telling a little bit of that story. All right, that was entertaining. That was fun, as always. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have recommendations for things you'd like me to do reactions to, I always welcome those. You can use the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone. Well, about a month ago, my 17-year-old daughter introduced me to PHILOMENA CUNK. She's a character played by an actress named Diane Morgan, who purports to be a investigative historian, kind of trying to tell a story, kind of narrating a documentary, and she's interviewing all these prominent historians and telling stories from history. And it's all a spoof. It's all like a farce. And I'm pretty sure the people she's interviewing are in on the joke, but they don't necessarily know what she's going to say. And it's absolutely hilarious stuff. So I thought I would dive into where she talks about World War I and just do a reaction to it. I saw my friend Mr. Terry did a reaction to her the other day, and it seems like it was very popular. So thought it would be fun. There's so much content out there that she's got. She's got a series on Netflix right now, which is hilarious. But I wanted to go into something that I was interested in that I knew a little something about. So this is from her episode 4 from her series on Britain. And it's called 20th Century Shocks. And it's going to begin with World War I. So I thought we'd watch, have a little fun. I'll try to decipher the real history from what she's saying, and it'll be interesting. I'll put the link in the description to the original content if you want to check it out and watch all the rest of it. But if you just look for PHILOMENA CUNK, you'll find all kinds of stuff on Netflix, on YouTube.
Nowadays, first world is something you put in front of the word problem to show that it isn't really that bad, like running out of couscous or not being able to check Twitter in a tunnel. But back then...
Not being able to check Twitter in a tunnel. First world problems, that's right.
First world was what they called the war. The First World War had loads of nicknames. The War to End All Wars, the Great War, and of course, World War I. Why did they call World War I World War I? It's quite pessimistic numbering, isn't it? Or did they just know it was the start of a franchise?
Did they know it was the start of a franchise? Well, of course, it wasn't called World War I at the time. It was called typically the Great War, or the War to End All Wars was kind of a nickname that they used for it, but usually the Great War.
At the time, they weren't numbering the wars, although I think that in the First World War, the idea of it being a great war, denoting the sheer scale of the conflict, the casualty rate, was already becoming used quite a lot.
And what I love about this is that you've got these real historians who are kind of the straight man to her comedy, and she just rolls with it. It's really so good.
So it was called the Great War, but not because it was great. The First World War was started by the killing of one man, Franz Ferdinand. You've probably never heard of him, or the band named after him.
Or the band. I knew she was going to go down the road of mentioning the band.
But he was dead important, by which I mean he was only important when he was dead. His assassination triggered a series of other killings. Soon it caught on, and everyone wanted to be killed.
Soon it caught on, and everyone wanted to be killed. This is the Imperial War Museum, which I was going to go to when I was in London the last time, but I didn't get a chance to get up there, but I definitely plan to. I've heard great things about it.
It was a bigger craze than fidget spinners. Eventually, Britain got sucked into the fighting, and men queued up to have their flat caps converted into fighting men's helmets. Soon, hundreds of thousands of Tommies were heading for battle.
So remember this time, I know I'm being serious with history, but we're going to have a good laugh too. Britain has a very small professional army, and they're one of the last major powers to actually institute any kind of a draft. So for a long time, the British Army tried to do everything through volunteers, and so they raised these PALS battalions where you could sign up with your friends from your town or from where you work. And of course, that was a nightmare, because if a battalion got wiped out at a place like the Somme or Ypres, pretty soon everybody from your town or everybody from your workplace is dead. But they also had this thing that they would do that was really clever and really just horrible at the same time, where women out on the street, if they saw a man who appeared to be of fighting age, but he wasn't in uniform, they would hand him a white feather, and it was a way of calling them a coward for not doing their part. And a lot of young men who were 15, 16 years old, who were too young to even be in the army, would get shamed into enlisting because somebody handed them a white feather.
Why were all the British soldiers in World War I called Tommy? Was that just a coincidence?
No, it wasn't a coincidence. It's just a general name that became applied to British soldiers in the same way we talk of Fritz as being a generic name for German soldiers.
He was called Fritz. They called him the Bosch a lot, and eventually Jerry was a name that was used especially in World War II to refer to the Germans.
What happened in Norman's Land? Were only people that were called Norman allowed in there?
Norman's
Land? It's not Norman's Land. This is no man's land. And the idea being that this is particularly dangerous territory between the lines of the Germans on one side and the British on the other. This is essentially just a killing zone, a very dangerous zone in between trench systems.
Why did they fire shells at each other? Because shells wouldn't really hurt, would they? Unless they were those razor clam shells, because they're quite sharp, aren't they?
Why would they fire shells at each other?
These weren't seashells. These were heavy pieces of ordnance.
He's doing his best.
Talking about bits of metal in brass casing, so that's where the name shells comes from.
All right. Looking at footage from the time, it's hard to get a grip on just how brutal it must have been for Tommy and Norman.
Tommy and Norman. So you have to understand, most of the time when you see footage or photos of action in World War II, it's a recreation. There are a few examples. Like there's this very famous photo of a French soldier in the middle of being hit and going down. It's not real. It's a recreation. There are a few examples of real combat footage. For example, Jeffrey Maylands shot some footage of men fighting in the area around the Hawthorne Ridge Redoubt at the Somme on July 1st, 1916. But almost all the footage you see of actual combat is going to be a recreation.
Because it's in black and white and everyone's moving too fast, probably to avoid the shells. Even though it looks a bit like Charlie Chaplin, it's actually not funny at all. So you can't laugh, just like with Charlie Chaplin.
One man who vividly captured the sheer horror of War I was the poet Wilfred Owen.
If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues.
So, One of the great things about World War I is the amount of incredible writing that comes out of the war. Poetry. Men who were on the front lines who, before the war, would not have considered themselves to be authors or writers of any kind, wrote some incredible poetry, and it happened on both sides. Men kept diaries, men did writing, they published this stuff. It was a way of dealing with what was otherwise just an impossibly horrible situation.
You get the gist.
My friend.
You get the gist.
As if the killing wasn't bad enough, the accommodation was scarcely worth 2 stars on TripAdvisor. Soldiers had to live in trenches, snaking cramped corridors of filth and squalor, without so much as a patio. The World War I trenches weren't the right place for conventional warfare, were they? But why did neither side think about mud wrestling? Because they're the perfect conditions, aren't they?
Why didn't they think about mud wrestling instead? Now, I will say this. While there were situations where I'm trying my best to enjoy the humor, but also try and tie it back to real history. While there were examples of men being in these trenches for a long period of time, especially during attacks and things like that, the typical system was for them to rotate. And so you had a series of trenches. You had a frontline trench, you had support trenches, things like that, communication trenches between them. Men would spend a couple of days. Each army did it differently. A couple of days on the front lines, and then they'd be rotated off, and then a different group would take their place. So at any given point, only maybe 20%, 30% of your actual force in a given area is on the frontline trench.
Aren't they?
Well, I mean, trench warfare wasn't new. I
No.
think that whilst you will get the occasional game of Christmas football, I don't think that anyone actually ever thought that letting the guns fall silent and having mud wrestling competitions was ever going to sort anything out.
Yeah, trench warfare goes back centuries, even maybe more than that. It was just the scale of trench warfare that happened and the length of time that it existed for.
You missed a trick, don't you? Eventually the war ended at 11 o'clock on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1119, 1118, hence the term stopping for 11s. The soldiers came home to a Britain they could hardly recognise because it was wearing a skirt. While the Tommies
Because it was wearing a skirt. Implying that women were doing a lot of the work while the men were on the front lines, which is totally true.
The front, women had stepped into their old jobs. There were women milkmen, women postmen, women bus driver men, even women male prostitutes.
Women male prostitutes. Okay.
Economy was in a pickle. After the war, many industries found it almost impossible to sell their goods abroad because abroad was mainly rubble. There were strikes and marches and a Great Depression. Things were shithouse bad. People needed escapism, but luckily for them, the age of mass entertainment was just beginning. It was the Roaring '20s. City streets were full of jazz clubs, packed with Jeeveses and Worcesters, and women with Lego haircuts dancing like they were surprised while shitting their pants at a fancy dress party. And people who couldn't afford to enjoy a Roaring '20s for themselves could still watch films of other people doing it at the newly invented cinema. The cinema was a cross between YouTube and theatre. Despite this, it was popular. And
it was a cross between YouTube and theater, and despite this, it was popular. Great point, though. Think about the men who survived this war, and they come back, and now you have the Roaring '20s, and you have like all of this new technology of the theaters becoming a big thing with movies, motion pictures. They had existed already, but and then you're going to get into television coming about in the 1930s and 40s. Boy, what a time to be alive. And then, of course, your sons are going to go back and fight the Second World War.
people queued to get in. They showed Charlie Chaplin films, but even that couldn't keep them away. The whole country went films bonkers.
Poor Charlie Chaplin. She's really digging on him, man. First talking about them not being funny, but then saying how people would come even though it was a Charlie Chaplin film.
Going to the cinema in those days was more like going to a book, because there was no sound. The story was explained by words on the screen. A bit like spoilers, but happening at the same time as you were watching it, so not as annoying. And if you couldn't make it to a cinema or cocktail bar, you could still enjoy the jazz age, because scientists had worked out a way to force jazz into your house using a magic called radio.
To force jazz into your house.
Radio was an exciting new invention that made it possible to hear other people's voices in your living room without the use of thin walls or a devastating mental condition. To help keep the early airwaves in check, the government created something called the British Broadcasting Corporation.
BBC.
The BBC. How come the BBC started with radio? Because radio's loads less popular than television, isn't it?
There are people in radio who'd get very angry about that. Radio still performs tremendously well.
There's still radio.
There is still radio.
There's still
At
radio.
the time the BBC was set up, there wasn't a choice because there was no TV.
Luckily, a man called John Logie Baird was about to give birth to television. Not literally out of his vagina.
Not literally out of his vagina. And like a lot of inventions, the television is not going to be the work of one single person, right? A lot of these inventions, take photography, for example, back in the early 19th century. There are a number of people in different places that are working on similar things, and different people are going to make breakthroughs that are going to help everybody's research, and then somebody's going to make that big breakthrough that really makes it happen, and they're the ones we typically get credit for. The Wright brothers were not the first people to work on heavier than air flight. They were just the ones who took all of that work that had been done by many people over the years and were able to perfect it and make it happen.
But metaphorically, out of his shed. After doing some weird experiments like something out of Wallace and Gromit, Baird's TV was finalised, although idiotically, he'd gone to the trouble of inventing it without checking whether there were any programmes on yet. It took a while before there was anything worth putting your iPhone down for. The earliest transmissions looked like Abraham Lincoln looming through a glass door and weren't very exciting. Luckily, it was a short step from there to the BBC's first Saturday night extravaganza, TV's opening night ceremony.
Vision and sound are on. The station goes on the air.
How awesome would that have been?
A mighty maze of mystic magic rays. The show got a record audience of 400, the sort of viewing figures BBC 4 still dreams of.
They got 400 people and BBC 4 still dreams of that.
Despite its popularity, the BBC was causing controversy from the start, and the powers that be were suspicious of it. Why did the government start the BBC in the first place? It seems like these days they're always trying to close it down. Was it one of those stupid mistakes they made, like Brexit?
Like
the
Brexit?
government didn't strictly start the BBC. The BBC was originally a private company in 1922. It employed a rather fierce Scottish guy called John Reith. And people still talk about Reithian values and Reithian broadcasting. Reithian values were to inform, educate, and entertain.
What, all at the same time?
Yeah.
Since those early days of black and white tat, the BBC has grown throughout the years to become one of the biggest programme shitting machines in the world, making groundbreaking, iconic programmes which still try to inform, educate or entertain.
Doctor Who.
So the BBC is supposed to inform, educate or entertain.
And entertain.
And entertain.
I'm going to list some BBC things and I want you to say whether they inform, educate or entertain. Okay. News at 10.
Inform.
Open University.
Educate.
Doctor Who.
Entertain.
Strictly Come Dancing.
Entertain.
Holmes Under the Hammer.
Entertain.
Inspector Phillips.
What is Inspector
He
Phillips?
doesn't know that one.
I made that one up.
I made that one up.
Okay, well, it didn't work.
Sounds real though, doesn't it? Inspector Phillips.
No, I instantly knew that it wasn't a real one.
Eat Well for Less. It's where Greg Wallace and another man see how much a family spend on a week's shopping and then criticise them. Make them eat porridge from Lidl.
Inform.
Well done.
Well
Sorry,
done.
I wasn't totting up the scores.
Thank you.
But this golden future of television would have to wait, because back in 1939 times, the TV signals were suddenly switched off, because someone decided to start another war to end all wars. When he became leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler was a funny-looking character with silly hair, a bit like Boris Johnson. But he turned out to be a hateful maniac who would let nothing get in the way of his ambition. A bit like Boris Johnson.
I knew that was coming. Boris Johnson, by the way, born in the United States.
Hitler believed the Germans were an elite race, like the Grand Prix. He also thought he
An elite race like the Grand Prix. Nice.
in Poland, and when he went round there to get it back, Britain cried war.
This country is at war with Germany.
Luckily, Britain had a hero on its side, a man whose name will never be forgotten, Winston Churchill.
A man whose name will never be forgotten, proceeds to say the name wrong. I love it.
Churchill's speeches were stirring and powerfully erotic.
We know it will be hard. We expect it will be long.
He was one of the greatest orators of all time, and some of the phrases he used still resonate today, such as finest hour, never surrender, and of course, we shall fight them bitches. And we needed Churchill's stirring mumbling, because at first the war didn't go well. Within 6 months, France was occupied by the Nazis, who they didn't see coming because...
And what's amazing about it is that Churchill actually takes office as the new prime minister on the day that the Germans launched their attack into the West, into France. So the very day that the British soldiers come under attack on mainland Europe is the day he takes office. I mean, I cannot imagine a tougher challenge than that.
They'd been expecting the Germans. Hitler wanted to make Britain German, to match its royal family, but they are...
He wanted to make Britain German to match its royal family. Yes, the British royal family is heavily German through multiple generations. 100% true.
RAF held Hitler's forces back in amazing dogfights in the sky that were done by aeroplanes, not actual flying dogs, which sadly science still hasn't invented yet. This was the Battle of Britain.
It seems amazing that these young men could fly and fight so well. Although when you look, you'll see the planes had tiny targets and crosses drawn on the side, which made them easier to hit.
But planes weren't only used in dogfights. The Germans changed tactics. Instead of attacking planes, which could move out of the way, they attacked the ground, which couldn't, in something called the Blitz.
Preceded by a shower of flares, German bombers rained fire and high explosive bombs in their most savage attack on London.
Hitler's pilots started dropping bombs.
Sort of aeroplane poos, and people had to...
Airplane poos. Wow. You know, one of the things that we as Americans will never be able to fully relate to, I don't think, is what it was like to be that close to your enemy, right? Because like when we fought World War II, yeah, the Japanese hit us in Hawaii, but Hawaii was a territory and it's 5 hours away by flying, even from Los Angeles. So it's still kind of out there, right? Our mainland was never really threatened. And so we didn't know what it was like to worry about sending our kids out of the city so they wouldn't be killed by a bombing raid. Not just the British, but of course the folks in France and Germany and Russia and other places who were really firsthand experiencing this war.
Hide from them.
They built big tin shelters in their gardens or ran down the nearest tube station without a ticket or a valid Oyster card. Countless houses were reduced to big...
Without a valid Oyster card. They did go down in the tube stations. Oyster card is something you can get to tap in and out. You can load it with money.
Piles of bricks and wood, which is sort of what houses are anyway, but in a different order. Despite this, thanks to the plucky British spirit, people weren't totally down in the dumps, even if they lived in one.
People sang songs during World War II to keep their spirits up, didn't they? How loud did they have to sing to be heard over the bombs?
Well, especially as they would have sometimes been in underground stations, sheltering from the bombs. It would have been loud in the underground station, the singing, if everybody was singing together, but it's true, you wouldn't have been heard much.
I wonder if when they sang, they used to time their singing with the explosions. That would be a fun thing to do.
Difficult. Very difficult to time it. It's quite random, the falling of bombs.
In the war...
He's just rolling with it. He's like it's no big deal.
Lots of songs taking the piss out of Hitler, weren't there? How come they don't sing those sorts of songs anymore?
Well, he's not around anymore, so it's not so amusing.
Where is he?
Where is he?
He's dead.
Yes.
Oh, right, so it'd be disrespectful to...
Well, not so much
speak
disrespectful as pointless, really.
Pointless.
A bit pointless.
Yeah.
A lot of singing was needed, because even when the Blitz ended, the war was far from over. There were many huge battles to come, most of which will never be forgotten, because they've since been converted into blockbuster movies.
How was it we beat the Germans at Dunkirk in War II, but still didn't win the whole war?
Well, first of all, I think we've got to stop calling it War II. I mean, it's the Second World War if you're American, and you have to have it this way, it's World War II. But, you know, that's the language we tend to use. But in terms of Dunkirk, I think that's the wrong way round. We actually lose at Dunkirk.
We lost at Dunkirk?
We lost at Dunkirk. I mean,
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
It turns out Dunkirk was a huge disaster. Like most sequels, War II was proving less fun than War I.
What made the war harder was that we didn't know what the Germans were planning, because they said it in a sort of code language known as German.
A code language known as German.
It took a team of British boffins using a magic typewriter called the Enigma machine literally loads of time to crack it, but crack it they did.
And with Germany's secrets twatted wide open, Britain and its allies were able to organise D-Day and invade France, but in a nice way.
In grueling and exciting scenes like these,
Call of Duty 2,
expertly depicted in the pulse-quickening video game Call of Duty 2, soldiers scrambled out of their boats, looking for power-ups and health kits, terrified...
Looking for power-ups and health kits. If only it were so easy.
Every second that a Nazi bullet might kill them, forcing them to respawn several feet away and be delayed by a number of seconds. Eventually the British won, and immediately there was widespread jubilation and people dancing about in black and white and getting off with people who were almost certainly dead now. A new, hopeful era had dawned, an era which 41 years later included the BBC painting and decorating television sitcom Brushstroke.
So we're going to wrap it up right there. I just wanted to go through World War I and World War II. If you want to see me react to more of her stuff, use the comment section below. Let me know if there's a specific one of her videos, a specific part of history that she covers that you think is especially entertaining, that would be fun to check out. And like I said, I'll put the link in the description to this original video. This is part of a much bigger series, Kunk on Britain. She's got, I think, Kunk on Earth, and there's some other ones too that are all really, really funny. So if you like that style of humor, I highly recommend you check it out. Thanks for watching.